The winter I turned 19 was the coldest in 40 years. People said that like it was a complaint. By the end of it, I understood it differently. The cold was the point. The cold was always the point. I was a freshman at Harwick University, which sits about as far north as a campus can sit before the administration runs out of reasons to call it a university and starts calling it a research station. The buildings were connected by underground tunnels because the administration had long ago admitted that walking between them in January would kill you. We lived underground like animals for 4 months out of the year, surfacing only when the food ran out or a class required it. The tunnels smelled like old concrete and forced air heat, and the accumulated decades of students who had made the same bargain, stay warm, stay alive, stay underground. Most of us didn't mind. You get used to the dark. My name is Luke Callahan. I was a first-year sciences student with a mediocre GPA, a work-study placement in the chemistry building where I washed equipment and logged temperature readings for a professor I rarely saw, and a roommate named Roger who was the best person I have ever known. I want to say that plainly at the start, because by the time this story reaches its middle you will understand why it needs to be said at the beginning, where the weight of it can grow alongside everything else. Roger and I were nobody. We were 2 kids from small towns who had been told that university was the next step, so we had taken it, and now we were here in the north in the cold, unsure what we were supposed to be becoming. We ate dining hall food and stayed up too late and made bad decisions with money and played cards on Thursday nights with 2 other guys from our floor whose names I have since lost, which bothers me more than it probably should. I think if nothing extraordinary had happened, we would have graduated in 4 years and lived ordinary lives and been reasonably content. I have thought about that version of things more times than I can count. I find it easier to think about than most of the alternatives. It started in the laundry room. Late November, finals 3 weeks out. Roger and I had put off laundry until we were down to our last clean anything, which meant a 10 o'clock run to the basement of Pemberton Hall with a bag of quarters and 2 beers each to make the waiting bearable. The laundry room was in the sub-basement, 1 level below the tunnel network, and it smelled like detergent and old pipes, and the particular staleness of any room that lives below ground and sees fluorescent light every hour of the day. 8 washers, 8 dryers, a row of folding tables that nobody wiped down, 2 plastic chairs. We had it to ourselves, which was fine. That was where I first saw Lily. She came in at 10:30 with a laundry bag over one shoulder and a look on her face like she was somewhere else entirely. Blonde, pale in a way that winter alone does not account for, eyes the color of lake ice in February, that flat, pressurized blue that has no warmth in it and does not apologize for the fact. She was beautiful in the way that certain things are beautiful because your brain cannot immediately classify them as a threat. She loaded a machine and left, and I noticed she had left a roll of quarters on top of the dryer. I should have set them aside and forgotten about it. Instead, beer being what it is, I decided to return them. Lily's room was in the east wing, 1 floor up. The door was unlocked. She had come back ahead of me and not latched it behind her. I could hear voices inside, low and strange, so I pushed the door open an inch and looked in, because I was 19 and curious, and not yet wise enough to fear what curiosity costs. The room was cold. Not the mild cool of a room with the window cracked. Cold the way a meat locker is cold, cold that had weight and intent, cold that registered in your throat before your skin and made each breath a small labor. Both windows were open to the November night, and both girls, Lily and her roommate Constance, who I had seen around campus and who had the same pale quality to her, the same stillness in the eyes, were standing in the middle of the room in the dark, heads tilted back, breathing it in. Their arms were loose at their sides. They were trembling, but not with cold, with something that looked like relief, like a creature returning to the environment it was built for. Then Lily's shirt fell open, and I saw what was underneath. The tentacles unfolded from somewhere in her chest cavity, smooth, pale, segmented, each one moving with the slow, deliberate patience of something that has never needed to hurry because it has never been hunted. They were organs, internal organs, worn on the outside, reaching for the cold air with what could only be described as hunger. They were not aggressive in that moment. They were simply present, the way a hand is present when it opens. Constance produced a canister from under the bed, pressurized, industrial, the kind of thing you sign a form to handle, and sprayed cryogenic gas across Lily's face and chest, and Lily arched backward, and made a sound that was nothing a human throat could make. A sound that had harmonics in it that did not belong to any instrument or any animal I had ever encountered. I was back in the hallway before I understood that I had moved, my back against the wall, the quarters still in my hand. I want to tell you I immediately understood what I had seen. I did not. The human mind has a powerful immune response to impossible information. It quarantines it. It builds a wall between what the eyes reported and what the brain is willing to process, and it stands at that wall and insists there must be an explanation on the other side. Cold weather medical condition, some kind of prosthetics, a trick of the beer and the dark. I spent 3 days in that quarantine. I went to class. I ate my meals. I kept looking at Lily across the dining hall. She sat with Constance always, never with anyone else, at a corner table near the window, where the frost came off the glass in small, visible crystals. And I thought about the canister, and I thought about the sound she made, and I told myself there was an explanation. Then Bobby Johnson turned up dead. Bobby was a third year, played lacrosse, had a girlfriend named Melody, and no enemies worth mentioning. They found him in his off-campus apartment on a Tuesday morning, frozen solid from the inside out, mouth locked open in a shape that had no name in the human expression vocabulary, not fear, not pain, not surprise, but something that seemed to combine elements of all three into a configuration no living face had ever held. The forensic team couldn't explain the mechanism. The campus paper ran a story that said acute hypothermia, and left it at that because the paper was run by 20-year-olds who were themselves frightened and not equipped to push harder. Detective Amanda Watts, who handled university jurisdiction cases, and who I knew slightly because she had dated my cousin the year before and had come to a family dinner once, told the press they were pursuing all avenues. I went to Amanda the day after Bobby's story ran. Her office was in the municipal building 3 blocks from campus, a small room with too much paper in it, and a whiteboard that was never entirely erased. She listened to me the way a seasoned detective listens to a 19-year-old freshman who claims to have watched 2 girls in a laundry room sprout tentacles and bathe in cryogenic gas. She wrote something in her notebook. She looked at me without expression for a moment, and then she said, "Anything else?" I said no. She told me to come back if I had more to go on. She was not dismissive in a way that felt personal. She had almost certainly heard stranger things and evaluated stranger sources. I did not fault her for it. Roger believed me without hesitation, which is a thing I have carried with me ever since. He sat on the edge of his bed that night. I had waited until we were alone and the floor had gone quiet, and he listened to the whole account. The laundry room, the windows, the sound, the canister, Bobby. He listened with his full attention, which was a quality he had that I have since encountered in perhaps 3 other people in my life. The capacity to listen without preparing what he was going to say in response, without filtering through his own experience for the nearest comparable, without performing skepticism or openness. He just listened, and then he nodded twice and said, "Okay, what do we do about it?" The first thing we tried was the camera. It was Roger's idea in its basic form. He said the problem was not knowing, it was having no evidence that anyone else would receive. We needed documentation, something Amanda could look at and could not explain away. His approach was methodical. Get the recording, get it to someone with authority, let the authority handle what came after. He was not thinking in terms of direct confrontation. He was thinking in terms of chain of custody and institutional response. That was how his mind worked, orderly, procedural, inclined toward the system even when the system had failed us several times already. I had a different read on how useful the system was going to be, but the camera was a good start regardless, and I agreed to it. We bought a small motion-triggered unit from the campus electronics shop with the last of my work-study check. I set it up in my room and spent 3 days maneuvering into Lily's proximity in ways that felt plausible: library, dining hall, the path between the science building and Pemberton that she walked on Tuesdays. She noticed me on the second day. I could feel the noticing, a specific quality of attention that felt nothing like being seen by a person who finds you interesting. More clinical than that, more like being assessed. On the 4th day, she came to my room. I had expected many versions of that moment. In most of them, she came in with some kind of cover excuse to borrow something, pretense of neighborly interest. Instead, she came in already dropping the pretense, already aware of the camera, already aware at some level that this was a trap, but coming anyway, which suggested that the trap was also an opportunity she was unwilling to leave on the table. What happened next was close enough to what I had hoped for, I can say that. The camera caught approximately 40 seconds of footage that would have been sufficient evidence for any rational evaluation before the malfunction happened. A power surge that the building maintenance log would later record as routine and localized. The screen on my phone went dark. Lily saw it happen. Her expression changed in the way her kind's expressions changed. Too fast, too complete. The face rearranging itself into something that made the human architecture underneath visible in its artificiality. And then she was moving, and then the candle on my desk went over and the curtain caught. She shed the form in the heat. I saw what they actually were, the true shape, the biological reality beneath the human template. For the full 3 seconds it took the fire suppression system to trigger. I will not describe it in detail because the detail is not what matters, and because some images are the kind that, if you describe them precisely enough, take up permanent residence in the listener and cannot be evicted. The shape was not monstrous in the Hollywood sense. It was simply profoundly not us. The wrongness of it was not in size or in violence, but in the deep structural difference. The evidence of a body that had solved the problems of existence using entirely different answers. Lily fled through the window. The fire suppression soaked my room. I sat on the wet floor and held the dead phone, and Roger found me there 20 minutes later when the smell of smoke reached him in the study lounge. He did not say, "I told you so." He sat down on the wet floor beside me and handed me one of the 2 beers he had apparently thought to bring, and we sat there while the suppression system dripped, and after a long time he said, "The camera didn't get it." "No," I said. He thought for a moment. "We try again differently." That was Roger. That was Roger. No drama. No defense of the world's normalcy. He trusted my eyes because he trusted me, and he thought the right response to discovering a monster in the building was to figure out what to do, not to debate the monster's existence. I have known braver people, technically. People trained for danger, people with more physical capability or more experience in genuine crisis. I have never known anyone with a more direct relationship to whatever situation was in front of them. He received the world as it actually was and responded accordingly. It sounds like a simple thing. Most simple things are the hardest. We started watching them. Not in a way that was easy to explain to anyone else, or to be proud of in the clean retrospective light. But we watched. We tracked their patterns across the campus, which buildings they entered and which they circled without entering, whether they used the underground tunnels. They did not, never, not once. They walked across open campus through the worst of the cold season, coatless in -15, while the rest of us could barely breathe through scarves. How they behaved on the rare days the temperature climbed above freezing. On those days they stayed inside. On the nights when the temperature fell hardest, there were more of them visible in the open, moving across the quad in 1s and 2s with the easy, unhurried gait of people who feel at home. We started counting. By the 2nd week of December, I had identified at least 9 individuals who matched the profile. All women, all living on campus or in the two off-campus buildings closest to the river, where the cold pooled in winter. All sharing the same quality of stillness, the same pale density, the same indifference to weather that should have been lethal. 9 that I could confirm. I did not let myself think about how many I might have missed. Gibby disappeared in the first week of December. Gibby was our friend. Ennis Gibbs, 3 doors down from us in Pemberton, a large jovial person who was the son of a plumber from a small Ontario town, and who carried that background with him in a way that was entirely without apology. He told the same 6 jokes on rotation, and somehow made each one feel like the first time. He had been seeing a girl named Natasha, dark-haired, very pale, came from somewhere even further north, she said, and left the specifics vague in a way that nobody pushed on because it wasn't a campus culture that pushed on personal specifics. Gibby had been happy about Natasha in the way that people are happy when they cannot believe their own luck. He went everywhere slightly elevated, slightly lit from within, as people in early love tend to do. He was gone one morning, his room locked from the outside, his jacket still on the hook by the door. His phone was on his desk. His laptop was open to a page he had been reading. Everything in the room was arranged like a life that had been briefly interrupted and expected to resume, and the fact of that arrangement, the normalcy of it, the jacket on the hook especially, because it was -20 outside, was more disturbing than any degree of visible disorder could have been. The campus went into a low-grade panic. Missing student, police involvement, posters on the bulletin boards that no one knew how to look at directly, because looking at them directly required accepting what they implied. His parents drove up from Ontario in a day and a half and sat in the campus security office looking the way people look when they are trying very hard not to understand what they already understand. I knew what had happened to Gibby. I could not prove it, and I could not say it in any way that would be received as anything other than the rambling of a disturbed freshman. That was the thing about those weeks that I still carry in my chest like a splinter too deep to reach. The knowing without being able to act on it. Watching something systematic and patient work through the people around me while I had no lever to use, no authority to summon, no language that anyone else would receive. The impotence of it was a specific kind of suffering. Not the grief, not yet, the grief came later and was its own thing entirely, but the impotence. The helplessness of the correctly informed with no means of transmission. I thought about that a great deal during those weeks. The way information can be perfectly accurate and perfectly useless simultaneously, depending on the container you try to pour it into. I had seen what I had seen. The evidence was in my own memory, vivid and detailed and unambiguous, and it was worth nothing in any forum that had the power to act on it because the evidence was in my own memory. We have built our institutions around the problem of self-interested witnesses, of people who see what they want to see, of testimony warped by desire and fear, and the human tendency towards self-confirmation. Those institutions are correct and important. They were also, in this specific situation, a wall I could not get through. The thing I was reporting was so far outside the expected range that no institutional mechanism could process it without physical evidence, and I had no physical evidence that had survived the night in my room intact. What I had was Roger, and Roger said, "We try again differently." I went to Amanda again. This time I had more. The pattern of cold rooms, the pattern of missing and dead young men, the absence of coats. The specific physiological profile of the victims, the locations and timing and the common thread of the women involved. She listened differently the second time. She did not write in her notebook. She looked at me across her desk with an expression I could not fully read, not belief, exactly, but a recalibration. A detective calculating new priors, adjusting the baseline, leaving more room in the framework for things that do not fit the standard template. She told me she needed physical evidence. I told her I was working on it. Roger, meanwhile, had started talking to Constance. He did not tell me right away. When he did tell me, He was careful about how he said it, not defensive, but deliberate, as though he had arranged the words in advance to make sure they landed without unnecessary alarm. He said he had run into her in the chemistry building of all places, where she apparently had a lab section on Tuesday afternoons. He said they had talked. He said she was not what we thought. I told him to stay away from her. I said it clearly and without softening it. I told him what I thought she was, what I was increasingly certain her kind had done to Bobby and to Gibby, and I told him that whatever she had said to him was designed to keep him proximate and compliant. I was not gentle about it. I was frightened for him in a way that made gentleness impossible. He listened to me say all of it with his full attention, the way he always did. And then he said, "Luke, I hear you, but I think she's telling me the truth." I should have tried harder. I have replayed that conversation across the years and tried to find the version where I say the thing that changes what happens next. I have never found it. You can know a person completely and love them without qualification, and still fail them at the exact moment that matters most, because you are trying to hold two things at once, their safety and their autonomy. And those two things can pull in opposite directions so hard that holding both means holding neither. Here is what Constance told Roger, and what Roger told me, and what I have since had years to sit with. They came from somewhere cold, a planetary system older than this one, orbiting a dim red star at the edge of what we would calculate as the habitable zone. Their world had cooled over a geological cycle spanning hundreds of millions of years, the star's output fatting as the planet's core went quiet, the oceans freezing over from the poles inward across millennia. The surviving population had adapted. Not quickly, in evolutionary terms, nothing adapts quickly in evolutionary terms, but persistently. Generation by generation, the survivors were the ones who could manage lower and lower internal temperatures, who could function in cold that killed everything else, who rebuilt their biology from the inside out to operate in conditions that should have been lethal. The tentacles were the result of that adaptation, a respiratory and reproductive system that had evolved to function optimally below zero, and that could not easily retract once the body dropped to operating temperature. They were not invaders in the war movie sense. They had no interest in territory or resources or industrial capacity, or any of the things that drive one civilization to move against another. They were a species at the end of its reproductive viability, a crisis that had been building across their last dozen generations, and they had found Earth by following the thermal signature of a warm biosphere and sent scouts ahead to determine if the species here could serve as compatible hosts for their reproductive process. The mating required cold, required it at the cellular level, in ways that the biology of the implanted organism had to match if the process was to proceed without killing the host. Humans could not match it. The scouts had not known that clearly enough at the start. They had assessed human physiology from external observation, and from what limited biological data they could access, and they had believed that human males were sufficiently hardy to survive the implantation's thermal requirements. They were wrong. The ones who died, Bobby and Gibby, and 3 others I eventually connected to the pattern but whose names I will not put in this account because their families deserve to hold those names without this context attached, died because their bodies could not maintain any functional state at the temperatures the implantation required. Constance told Roger she hadn't wanted any of them to die. I believe she meant it. I have thought about whether that changes anything and I still don't have a clean answer. Intention is not the same as consequence. The dead are still dead regardless of the warmth or coldness of the feeling that preceded their dying. I do not think she was lying about the grief. I think the grief was real, and I think it did not prevent any of it from happening, which is not a paradox if you have spent any time observing what desperation does to organisms who are running out of options. But Roger sat with Constance in her cold room, cold the way her kind required, windows open, the temperature inside holding somewhere around -10, and he listened to her explain the extinction curve of her species and the desperation that had brought the scouts here. He was quiet for a long time when she was done, and then he asked her if there was any chance a human could survive the process. She said she did not know. She said no human had survived it yet. She said she thought it might be possible, theoretically, if the human were healthy and the conditions were optimal, and the implantation were done slowly and carefully by someone who understood what they were doing. He told her he was willing to try. He made that decision himself with full information, with his eyes open. He was not deceived. He was not manipulated in any way I can identify in retrospect. He was a person who heard about a dying species and decided that if there was something within his capacity to do about it, he was going to do it. That was who he was. That is the true version of what happened. I was across campus when it happened. I had spent the evening with Amanda. She had requested the meeting, which meant she had moved past her skepticism far enough to want more data. We sat in her office for 3 hours going through what I knew, what she knew, what the forensic reports suggested, and what they couldn't explain. 2 more students had turned up in the previous week with the same symptom profile as Bobby, frozen from the inside, the expression on their faces that had no name, and the official explanation of acute environmental hypothermia was straining under the weight of the pattern. Amanda was a thorough person and a precise thinker, and by midnight she had a working framework for what we were dealing with, even if she had not yet said the word alien out loud, and I was not going to say it for her. My phone rang at midnight. Roger's number. When I answered, there was a sound I had never heard him make, not pain exactly, but something past the range of ordinary human response, something the body makes when it is being asked to do something it was never designed to do. I ran. Through the tunnels, up the east stairwell, down the corridor to their room. I have never run like that before or since, the kind of running that empties the mind of everything except the single destination, that turns the body into a pure instrument of forward motion and leaves no capacity for anything else. The kind of running you do when you already know, at some cellular level below conscious thought, that you are running towards something you cannot fix. The door was unlocked. The windows were open to the full depth of a -24 December night. The cold in the room was complete and pressurized and immediate. The fluorescent light above the desk cast everything in the flat, overlit way of rooms in crisis. Roger was on the floor on his back, and Constance was beside him kneeling, and the thing I least expected was her face, grief, uncomplicated and total, the grief of someone who had gambled with another person's life on the basis of a hope that had not held. She was not alien in that moment. She was not whatever category I had constructed for her kind. She was a living thing that had tried something and watched it fail in the worst possible way, and was sitting with what that cost. Something small moved in the air above Roger's open mouth, small and pale, moving with its own slow purpose. Then it was gone. He looked at me when I came through the door. His eyes were clear, and he knew me, and he said my name. Then he was gone, and what remained was a body, and that is the most complete transformation I have ever witnessed, and the one I am least equipped to describe. Because the difference between a person and a body is not visible, but is absolute, and the moment of crossing from one to the other is the starkest thing a human being can observe. Constance said nothing. She held his hand, which was already past the temperature at which hands can hold warmth. I left her there. I am not proud of what followed in the next hour. Grief, when it has no place to go, becomes fuel for something harder and more focused and less clean. I want to be honest about that because pretending otherwise, performing the calm of a person who has processed their loss and arrived at measured resolve, would be a disservice to the account. I was not calm. I was not strategic in the way strategy is supposed to work. I sat in my own room in the dark for 40 minutes, and then I got up and I called Amanda, and I told her we were out of time for frameworks and evidence and working theories. She answered on the second ring. She said, "Tell me what you need." By 4 in the morning, we had a plan. It was crude, and it was built on improvisation, and it was the best we could do with the resources available to two people. One of them, a detective with access to university, building schematics and maintenance records. One of them, a chemistry work-study student who had spent a semester wandering the maintenance corridors of 4 campus buildings, and who had learned in that wandering more than he had been assigned to learn about the thermal infrastructure that kept the whole campus from freezing. What we knew, they were drawn to the cold. They operated in the underground tunnel network at night because it was their best access to the campus without exposure. What we knew, heat destroyed them. The fire in my room, the candle Lily had knocked over during my failed attempt to record her on camera 4 nights before the tunnel operation, had been enough to drive her out of her human form entirely. She had not simply reacted to the pain. She had come apart. The heat did not just damage them. It reversed whatever biological process permitted them to hold the human form together, unraveled the proteins or the cellular structures or whatever mechanism allowed the disguise to function, and left them raw and unable to maintain the shape. The university's central heating system ran through high-pressure steam pipes in the maintenance corridors beneath every building on campus. The steam left the central plant at 312 degrees under approximately 150 pounds of pressure per square inch, distributed through a network of insulated lines to radiators and air handlers throughout the system. The pressure regulation valves and emergency shutoffs were located at junction points in the maintenance tunnels. I had seen them on my work-study rounds, and had noted them the way you note anything that seems like it might matter someday, not knowing then what someday would look like. The central tunnel junction was the intersection of 4 major corridors beneath the campus core. It was where the heating lines crossed, where the emergency pressure manifold was located, where any disruption to the system would be most total. We set up there at 5 in the morning. The temperature outside was -27. The tunnel junction was cold because the heating system ran at reduced pressure through the overnight hours standard efficiency protocol, and we were counting on the cold being enough to draw them into the covered network rather than across open campus. Amanda had the maintenance schematics. I had the layout memorized. We had a crowbar and a pipe wrench, and a detailed knowledge of where the emergency pressure release coupling was located, and what it would do when it was cracked. It worked. That sentence covers an hour I am still not able to account for in clean linear terms. There were 4 of them in the tunnel when they found us. Lily, who I recognized without difficulty. Natasha, whom I had not seen since Gibby disappeared, and whose face had a quality of controlled grief that mirrored Constance's, and that I noticed and filed without having any use for it in the moment. 2 others I recognized as faces from campus, girls I had passed 100 times in the dining hall and the library and the tunnel corridors without registering as anything beyond students. In the tunnel under the fluorescent emergency lighting they looked almost ordinary. Almost. The cold they carried with them was perceptible as a pressure change before it was perceptible as temperature. Your sinuses registered it. Your inner ear made a small, involuntary adjustment, and then the cold arrived in your chest, and the calculation became immediate. Lily recognized me. She stopped perhaps 10 feet out, and the others stopped with her, that coordinated stillness that I had observed from a distance a dozen times, and that never looked quite right up close because the synchronization was too complete, too instantaneous, no lag for individual human reaction time. All 4 of them perfectly still, perfectly aligned, the way a school of fish turns not together, but as one organism. She told me I didn't understand what I was doing. She said it evenly, without threat in the voice, in the tone of someone correcting a misunderstanding before it required escalation. She said her kind were not here to harm anyone. She said the deaths had been mistakes, failures of biological knowledge, and that they would not have happened if the scouts had fully understood the limits of human physiology before beginning. She said there were hundreds of thousands of her kind in cryosuspension in orbit, waiting on the scouts' report, and that what I was doing would strand them. I had not known about the hundreds of thousands. I stood with that for a moment. The full weight of it, lives that would end because of what I was about to do, lives I had no way to reach or to save or to factor into any calculation I was capable of making. I thought about Bobby's face, the expression with no name. I thought about Gibby's jacket on the hook. I thought about Roger on the floor of a cold room saying my name. I told her she was right that I didn't understand most of it. I told her I was sorry about the parts I did understand. I told her the deaths she called mistakes were not mistakes by any definition I had access to. And I told her none of it changed what I was going to do. She had a response to that ready. I could see it forming not in her expression, which barely moved, but in a shift in the posture, a slight forward lean, the biological preparation of something about to accelerate. She was going to make an argument for survival that had the full weight of a species extinction behind it, and it was going to be a strong argument, and I was aware that if I let it continue long enough I might not be able to act. I did not let it continue. I said, "Amanda." She came at me at the same moment Amanda's wrench found the manifold coupling, faster than I was prepared for and faster than anything that size should have been able to move. The tentacles cleared her chest before she had covered half the distance. Amanda hit the manifold at the precise moment. I will say it simply. The emergency pressure release cracked the high-pressure line at the junction coupling, and what came through was superheated steam at full plant pressure, 312 degrees, 150 pounds per square inch, in a confined tunnel junction 12 feet wide and 8 feet high. The sound was a mechanical scream that the concrete walls threw back from every direction simultaneously. The steam cloud filled the junction in under 5 seconds. I was behind the pressure shield of the far tunnel entrance, a structural recess I had identified from the schematics, deep enough to break the direct blast front. Amanda was behind me. The heat reached us as a wave of air that felt like opening an oven, and then the pressure differential in the tunnel system equalized and the steam billowed, and then the sound tapered into a high mechanical hiss. What happened in the steam cloud I will not describe in more detail than this. It was quick, and it was final, and it was not clean. They made sounds. Not the same sound as before, not the relief or the pleasure of the cold, but something stripped of the human overlay, something that came from whatever they actually were underneath the adaptation that let them pass. Lily held the form the longest. I do not know whether that was strength or simply biology, whether the more complete adaptation held together better under thermal assault. In the end, the heat was what it always is, indifferent, absolute, patient beyond any organism's capacity to outlast it. When the steam cleared enough to see, there was nothing in the junction that required further action. Constance was not in the tunnel. I had not expected her to be. I found her an hour later in the cold room, still on the floor beside Roger's body. She had not moved. The windows were still open, the night still pouring in, the temperature in the room deep enough that my breath came out in solid clouds. She looked up when I came in and there was nothing threatening in it. She was empty in the way that genuine grief empties a thing, down to the structural minimum, nothing left that could be mistaken for menace or intent. I stood in the doorway for a long time. Roger had said, "I think she's telling the truth." I did not use the pipe wrench on Constance. I want to say that was a fully formed ethical decision arrived at through careful reasoning. It was partly that. It was partly that she was sitting beside my dead friend with his hand in hers, and had not moved toward me, and posed no immediate threat. And there is a line somewhere in the human moral architecture between defense and execution that I was not willing to cross when the target was stationary and grieving, and had already lost whatever operation she had come here to complete. I called Amanda from the doorway. She came with 2 other officers and they took Constance into custody, and whatever happened after that happened without my involvement. I was not part of those decisions, and no one asked me to be. The official world received Constance and began the process of figuring out what category to put her in, which I assumed would take considerably longer than any of them anticipated. When they led Constance out of the room, she paused at the door and looked back at Roger. She said something in a language I did not recognize. Short, 3 syllables. The cadence of it was the cadence of a farewell, and I have never asked anyone to translate it because I don't want to know if I'm wrong about what it was. The university put out a statement about a carbon monoxide event in the Pemberton Hall tunnel network. Maintenance failure, steam pipe rupture, emergency response required. 2 students confirmed deceased. Roger's name was included with his parents' permission, and the other name listed was a cover identity for someone the university and the local police had agreed not to explain publicly. The federal agency that absorbed the investigation came in quietly over the following week, collected everything that could be collected, and left without speaking to me directly, which I have since interpreted as their judgment that I was not a security concern. I knew what I had seen, but I had no means of proving it and every incentive to be quiet about it. I graduated in 4 years. Chemistry degree. Not a distinguished academic career, but a completed one, which under the circumstances felt like the appropriate metric. I went home the summer after freshman year, and my mother asked me if I was all right, and I said yes, which was true in the way that things can be true at the surface, while something entirely different operates underneath. She looked at me for a moment longer than the answer required, and then she nodded and started talking about something else, because she was a person who understood that some things needed to come out on their own schedule, and that pushing before they were ready was a form of damage. Amanda called me twice in the years that followed. The first call came 18 months after the tunnel, to tell me that the investigation had been absorbed by a federal agency she declined to name, and that the classification level involved meant she would not be able to discuss any aspect of it going forward. The second call came 3 years after that, brief and oddly formal, to tell me that the biological samples from the tunnel and from Roger's body had been classified at a level that precluded any further communication on the subject, and that she was calling now, before the classification came down, because she wanted me to know that someone outside of me also held the knowledge of what had happened. She said, "You're not the only one who knows." Then she said goodbye. I thanked her. That was the last conversation. I am older now. I teach chemistry at a small college on the East Coast where the winters are mild. I have arranged my life in a specific radius around that mildness, the latitude, the proximity to the coast, the maritime air that keeps the temperatures from falling too far. My colleagues think I simply prefer warmth. That is true, and it is not the whole truth, and the whole truth is not something I have ever found occasion to share. I live alone. I have a dog, a large, calm, undemanding animal named after a theorem I find beautiful, and a house that is slightly too big for one person, and that I have arranged over the years into something that functions. I sleep well enough, which took years to become true, and which I am grateful for without being able to entirely trust. On the worst nights I am back in the tunnel in the steam, and the sounds are there again, but those nights are less frequent than they used to be, and the mornings after are manageable. You learn the management. It is a practical skill like any other. I do not think about that winter every day. That also took years. What I think about when I think about it is Roger. Not the moment at the end. I have worked hard to keep that moment in its proper scale, significant, definitive part of the record, without letting it eclipse everything that preceded it. I think about the earlier moments. The laundry room at 10 o'clock, 2 beers in, the machines running, him laughing at something I've already lost. The way he listened. The way he said, "Okay, what do we do about it?" without flinching or performing or making the situation about his own response to it. The decision he made at the end, which I have examined from every angle available to me in the years since, and which I cannot in good conscience call wrong. I can call it unbearable. Those are not the same thing. Here is what I know about what happened, and what it cost, and what it proved. They came here because they were dying. They used what they had: appearance, adaptation, biological imperative as powerful as any drive evolution has ever produced. Because survival is the oldest argument any species makes, and it does not require justification to feel absolutely compelling from the inside. They were not malicious in the way that word usually functions. They were desperate, which is a different thing and in some ways a more frightening one, because desperation has a logic that malice does not. Malice can be opposed on moral grounds. Desperation requires you to understand it even as you stop it, and understanding is harder and costs more. And we stopped them. Not with a fleet, not with a coordinated planetary defense, not with a weapon that governments had spent decades developing against exactly this contingency. We stopped them with 2 people in a maintenance tunnel and a pipe wrench and the specific knowledge, bought at a price I will spend the rest of my life accounting for, of one specific weakness, applied at the right moment, without hesitation. I have thought about whether that is something to be proud of. The answer I keep arriving at is that proud is the wrong category. What happened was necessary, and it cost more than it should have, and the accounting is not yet finished. But it was done by 2 people who had nothing, no training, no mandate, no institutional backing, no certainty that they were right. And who did it anyway, because the alternative was to do nothing, and they were not built for doing nothing when doing nothing had a specific visible cost in the faces of specific people they knew. That is the thing about the hesitation. Everyone who has not been in a moment like that underestimates the flinching problem. The way the body makes its full argument at the last second. This is too much. This is beyond your capacity. Step back, reconsider. There must be another way. You have already lost enough. Every self-preservation instinct you have spent a lifetime constructing makes its case simultaneously, in full voice, at the exact moment when the window for action is narrowest. And you have to override all of it at once on the basis of something as thin and stubborn as the knowledge that, if you step back, something worse happens to someone else. I did not step back. I say that not to congratulate myself. I was frightened the entire time, and I acted frightened, and I am not going to retroactively smooth that into something cleaner. I say it because I think it is the one true thing about human beings that the universe consistently underestimates. We are bad at knowing our limits, not in the overconfident action movie way that gets people killed, in the actual way. The way that means when something asks us what we can bear, we genuinely do not know the answer until the moment of asking, and the answer is routinely more than anything reasonable would predict. They had studied us. Whatever intelligence had preceded the scouts, whatever biological and behavioral assessment had been done before they arrived, they had calculated that humans would not be a meaningful obstacle. We were too fragmented, too small in our individual actions, too reliant on institutions and authorities and collective response mechanisms that move slowly and require verification and chain of command before they act. They were right about most of that. They were right that we are not, as a species, well configured for rapid unified response to a threat we cannot yet name. They were right that our systems of knowledge and authority are slow and skeptical, and require the kind of evidence that a careful, patient infiltration is designed to never produce. What they had not accounted for was the space between the institutions, the 2 people in the basement, the one who refuses to stop looking and the one who says, okay, what do we do about it? They had not modeled for the fact that human beings in proximity to people they love do not require institutional authorization to act. We do not wait for the signal from the top. We do not wait for consensus or official confirmation, or the moment when the evidence crosses the threshold that the system requires. When the person 3 doors down has his jacket on the hook and is not coming back to get it, something in us that is older than any institution decides to move. They had not modeled for grief as fuel. They had not modeled for the stubbornness of the correctly informed with nothing left to lose. And by the time they understood those things, it was 5 in the morning in a maintenance tunnel, and the pipe coupling was already cracked. They had not accounted for the fact that grief, for us, is not a reason to stop. For some species, perhaps, loss is a signal to withdraw, to reassess the cost-benefit, to cut losses and redirect resources to more viable avenues. For us, grief is frequently the exact opposite. For us, grief has a way of removing the margin, the comfortable distance between action and inaction, the question of whether it is worth it. When the person you have lost is Roger, the question of whether it is worth it ceases to have any traction. There is no calculation that produces the answer stop. I don't know what became of Constance. I have thought about her more than I expected to in the years since. I have thought about her 3 syllables at the door and Roger's hand in hers, and the fact that she had tried to do something that had not worked, and that she had stayed with him afterward when staying served no strategic purpose whatsoever. A creature optimizing for survival would have been gone before I arrived. She stayed because something beyond optimization was operating in her. Call it love, call it guilt, call it the same irrational insistence on presence that leads humans to sit beside hospital beds and hold hands that can no longer feel them. Whatever it was not nothing. I hope the people who received her were curious before they were conclusive. I hope someone sat across a table from her and asked real questions and listened to the full answers before the classification came down. I don't know. That is entirely outside what I can know, and I have made what peace with that I am capable of making. The last winter I spent at Harwick, senior year, I walked across open campus on the coldest morning of the year, -29 by the thermometer outside Pemberton Hall. The sky was the flat pressurized white of a sky that has decided to commit to winter indefinitely, a white that is not bright but heavy, the color of something that has made up its mind. The campus was empty of everyone, not a single person in either direction across the quad. Everyone was underground, which was the sensible place to be, which was where human beings had decided to put themselves when the environment made the argument for it clearly enough. I walked to the east wing and stood outside and looked up at the windows on the 2nd floor. The cold went through everything I was wearing inside of 40 seconds. My lungs registered each breath as a small controlled pain, that specific deep cold that gets past the layers and makes itself known in the bones of your chest. I stood there until I was done with whatever I had come to be done with, which was not the grief. The grief does not finish, not the real kind, but something adjacent to it, some accounting that required being done in that place and in that temperature and could not be completed anywhere warmer or more comfortable. Then I went inside. That is all there is at the end of something like this. You survive what you were not supposed to survive and you go inside. You go back to the tunnel corridors and the lab tables and the daily ordinary requirements of a life that continues. You go forward. The cold has no opinion about whether you make it, which is not comfort exactly but is something. It asks nothing of you, expects nothing, and when you remain standing in it, the fact of remaining standing is entirely and only your own. Roger would have found something precise to say about that, something dry and accurate that reframed the whole situation into something slightly more bearable without making it smaller or easier than it actually was. He had that gift. The ability to find the exact word that names a thing clearly without diminishing it, that gives you the handle you need to carry it without pretending it weighs less than it does. He would have handed me a beer. We would have sat in the basement laundry room with the machines running and the detergent smell and the bad plastic chairs and the fluorescent light that made everything look slightly underwater, and it would have been enough. It was always enough. That is the thing I keep returning to, the thing I want to be the last thing I say. It was always enough. The ordinary hours were complete in themselves. 2 unremarkable people being unremarkable together in a basement is a full thing, not a lesser thing, not a placeholder for something more significant. You do not need to survive anything extraordinary to justify the value of those hours. But if something extraordinary comes for the people in that basement, you pick up the wrench. You stand in the cold. You do not step back. That is what we are at the bottom of everything. Not heroes. Not anything that requires a category beyond ordinary people who refused, at the specific moment it mattered, to stop. They walked into that and found out what it costs to underestimate it. I think about Roger every day. I think the least I can do is make sure that's true.